Welcome everyone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through where to find some of the information about setting up JupyterHub, and then I'm going to go through setting it up, and we'll do a bit of demos of what JupyterHub is and what it does, and what's involved there. So where I'm going to start, so I'll share my screen. So I'll start at the JupyterHub repository on GitHub. And so where we're going to start is at the documentation. So most repositories on GitHub will have a link to a homepage or to documentation over on the About section. So this is a link to the JupyterHub docs. And because we're working on development, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch from the default documentation, which is the stable version, which is the latest release, is I'm going to be looking at the latest version, which is the kind of the current development version, which will be the latest version in the GitHub repository, which right now has a very tiny difference because we just made a release a couple days ago. So the part that where we're going to be looking at is contributing. So this is where we have documentation about working on JupyterHub. So these are the documents. This is the documentation that Alan's going to be working on reorganizing. All this JupyterHub documentation, not just the contributing stuff. And so we have information about where to get in touch, where to talk to everybody, whether it's development discussion or talking about with the community more broadly. And where we're going to start is setting up development install. So getting everything installed so that we can work with JupyterHub. And so the first step that you need to set up JupyterHub is you need Python. Yeah, so JupyterHub being kind of server software, we've made the choice to not officially support Windows. It does technically work on Windows. We don't run our tests on Windows, and it's a little trickier to set up a development environment there. So generally, our recommendation is if you're on Windows, you could use VirtualBox to set up something in Ubuntu to get going there. On a Mac, you have everything you need. So to get Python, there are a few ways to get Python. The simplest way to get Python on Linux is with apt. So you would do something like apt-get install Python 3 dev, I believe, to get a Python 3 installation with development tools and Python 3 pip, right? So pip is the Python tool for installing packages. So we're going to use the operating system or a lower level tool to get Python itself. And then we're going to use the kind of the language tools to install their package dependencies. But JupyterHub, to run JupyterHub, it's not just a Python package. There's one of our dependencies is actually a JavaScript package in Node.js. So something called the configurable H2B proxy, and we'll see kind of what that does in a bit. For none of these projects are we going to work on this, so we just need to have these things installed in order to run JupyterHub. So you don't need to know anything about JavaScript or how to work on these tools. We just need to be able to install them. So in Linux, you can apt-get install Node.js. I believe is the package to get that package. And on a Mac, there are kind of two standard ways to get Python and Node. One would be the package manager Homebrew that I'd highly recommend for anybody who's doing development on a Mac. So Homebrew is kind of a package manager for Mac, and there's a one-line command to install it. And so if you have that, you can install Python and Node with Homebrew. Which I probably already have. Yeah, so I have have Node and I have Python. So once you have those two things, you're well on your way. And there's lots of ways to install those. Another one is Conda. Is you can mini forge as an installer to set up a Conda environment. And Conda is a package manager, like Homebrew, that can install things, like can install Python itself, can install Node.js itself. And also to work on the repository, you'll need Git for cloning the repo and things. So the first step to doing this is we're going to clone the repository from the JupyterHub repo, and we're going to CD in there. So now I'm taking the JupyterHub repo from GitHub and I have it locally here. So now I see all the same files that I saw when I was browsing the repo. So I have JupyterHub, and there's kind of three things that I'm working with here. There's JupyterHub, the package that I might want to work on. There's the tests for testing JupyterHub that Sheila's going to be working with. And then there's the documentation in the docs directory that Alan's going to be working on. So to make sure that I've got everything that I need, I can do Python. I can make sure I have Python and make sure I have npm so that I can install things. And then what we need to, part of JavaScript, part of JupyterHub is because JupyterHub is a web application, there's some front-end components, some JavaScript that gets run on the page that we use some JavaScript tools to build as a part of installing JupyterHub. So we're going to make sure that we have our JavaScript dependencies installed. So being a Python package, all the Python dependencies get installed automatically, but Python packages can't express dependencies kind of across languages. So we have to install our JavaScript dependencies explicitly. So we say, give us configure by HTTP proxy, which we need to run JupyterHub, and yarn, which we need to build some packages. And if you were using Conda, you would use the Conda install command for the same packages. So now that we have what we need to build JupyterHub, we're going to do an editable install. So this is what we do generally for working on just about any package. This is the same command you would give no matter what package you were contributing to, is you do pip install editable because you're going to be working on it, and then dot for the current directory. And then we're adding brackets tests to install not just JupyterHub itself and all its dependencies, but also the dependencies that we record for whether for running the tests. And so this is going to find all the things it depends on, and it's going to install everything that we need both to run JupyterHub and also run the tests for JupyterHub. And so building JupyterHub itself takes a little bit, mostly because it's doing that JavaScript build step. It's downloading some JavaScript packages and it's compiling some JavaScript files. And then finally, it's installing everything. And so now I should have what I need to start JupyterHub. And I'm going to use the which command just to make sure, since I probably have JupyterHub installed a million times on my computer at this point, just going to make sure that I'm using the JupyterHub I expect. And I type JupyterHub. So now that I've typed JupyterHub, what this is doing is it's actually launching the JupyterHub application. And it's doing a bunch of things. So one of the things it did here was starting the proxy. So when you run JupyterHub, it starts a proxy process that's really the thing that people talk to when they're using JupyterHub. And then there's JupyterHub organizes a collection of processes behind behind the proxy. And I'll look through some architecture diagrams of what JupyterHub really is in a minute. But now we have JupyterHub is now running at HTTP colon. Let's make this give you a little bit more on the screen here. And then there's no IP here, so it's running on all interfaces. It's running at port 8000. So if I put that in my browser, then I can see this is the login page. So this is the first page you get to in JupyterHub. Right, so I've gotten all the way to, I'm running JupyterHub locally, and I can start to use it in those commands so far. But the kind of default configuration is not really what we want to use for testing JupyterHub and playing with JupyterHub. It is for kind of running a real server on a shared system. So what we have in our repo is in the testing directory, there's a configuration file that is useful for kind of running test deployments locally and poking around and checking. So if we stop JupyterHub with Control-C, I can run JupyterHub-f testing. I'll just copy the commands on your type. And there will be a note saying here we're using the spawner, our simple spawner, and we're using the authenticator, our dummy authenticator. And what those mean, when I go here, that means I can type any username, and any password, and login will work. And so now we can talk a little bit about what JupyterHub does. So when I logged in, it launched a Jupyter Notebook server for me. So this is where we get into the line between what's Jupyter and what's JupyterHub. So this is the Jupyter Lab application for working with files, running code, reading documents, and doing all kinds of work. Right, so I have this workspace, and this is my workspace. So you can see in the URL, it has /user/any username. And we're not really in JupyterHub anymore. So what JupyterHub has done is it has started a Jupyter server for me and set up the authentication so that only I can access it. But once I'm at this, talking to this server, kind of JupyterHub's job is done. And so that's kind of where the scope of what we're working on this this project, the scope kind of ends when we get to, so you've finally gotten to your workspace. You can do whatever it is you can do in a Jupyter environment. That's kind of beyond our concern in the JupyterHub project. The JupyterHub project is all about getting to here, and now you can go do your work. And at this point, all JupyterHub wants to do is get out of the way. So now we can look at kind of an overview of what JupyterHub is. So this is our big diagram of when you're running JupyterHub, what does it look like? So I have a browser, and I'm making requests to a web server somewhere. In this case, everything's running on my laptop, but it could be running, in the cloud or on a supercomputer or wherever. And so there's this proxy. And what a proxy is something that handles web requests and forwards them to another. It's a web server that handles web requests, but instead of responding directly, it sends those web requests on to one or more other servers. And so most of what JupyterHub is a tool for launching notebook servers for each user and then routing the requests and handling the authentication for each user. So when I log in, I get a server, and JupyterHub is responsible for logging me in. So this is authentication, saying, who are you? Right, how do you verify who you are? And then the next thing it does is once it's decided, okay, I know who you are, you're allowed to use this service. There's another API we have called the spawner that is for launching servers. And this is because there's lots of different ways to launch a notebook server. You can launch them as just another process on the computer, like I did here, or they could launch in containers in the cloud. They could get their whole new virtual machines. It could be, there's ultimately all JupyterHub cares about is that you started a notebook web server somewhere, and then you tell it where it is. And so any way that people can think of to start a notebook server is you might write a spawner for that says, okay, you've asked me for a spawner for a notebook server. I know where to start one, and then I tell you where that is. So the spawner and authenticator are kind of the two main extension points in JupyterHub. So there's lots of implementations of this, like log in with GitHub, log in with Google, log in with your your university credentials, whatever, or a simple username and password. And the spawner is start a server with Kubernetes, with Docker, with a local process, and all the different ways you might do that. And then, so you log in, you start a server, then the hub tells the proxy, now send requests for this /user/the username to that user's server. And then there are layers involved in kind of how they all talk to each other and the security of all that we don't really need to get into. But the important thing is there are for any given user, there are three things running, right? There's a proxy, there's a hub, and then you have your server, and they all talk to each other. So I will, and so if I look at my, go back to my control panel. No, that's not what I want. Click the right button. And so JupyterHub has only a couple pages, right? So you have the home page, which has just these two buttons, go to my server and stop my server. And it has a token page for managing API tokens that I might have. And then there's an admin page that I currently don't have access to right now that has a bit more features of like getting an overview of all the users on a given hub. Actually, I can probably switch over. I can probably do a quick start over. Yeah, and there's a third admin page that lets me view all the users where I can start and stop and see what they do, see properties about them. So there's not a whole lot to JupyterHub. So we have a few of these pages, and mostly what we do is we start and stop Jupyter servers. Most of JupyterHub works through what's called a REST API. So the REST API is a style of web API for making requests and transactions. So you make a web request and it does something like create a user, start a server, stop a server, list what users exist. And where did that? No, not that one. That's the one. Right, so these are all the different requests you can do and the actions you can do with the JupyterHub web API. And so a lot of this is what our tests cover. So that's kind of the next topic. So I have, I'm gonna stop my Jupyter Hub. So now that I have a Jupyter Hub install, I can run the tests. And so we use a tool called PyTest, and all the dependencies have been installed already because we installed that with the, adding this bracket test means also install the test dependencies. So we can run the tests. I can run PyTest and I'll add -vx. So v is show me the name of each test as it goes, and x is stop as soon as anything fails. And so what this does is it finds all our tests, and something didn't work. Oh, why is that? Okay, so there's a dependency that we need for our tests because our tests, JupyterHub. Yeah. That'll be in the documentation we'll get next. So we're in PyTest and JupyterHub. And so this will find all the tests that we have and run all those tests and tell me which ones worked, which ones didn't. It takes a few minutes to run them all. So I won't go through all of that. So that's how you test JupyterHub, and the tests live in the tests directory in the JupyterHub package. And PyTest is configured with these things called fixtures that will be highly relevant to Sheila's work. So the JupyterHub tests have a bunch of useful fixtures for starting up JupyterHub and talking to it. And it does things like make sure that we use a temporary database so that we don't create files in the local directory, or put the database in memory and load up things by default. And then we also use some of these fixtures to change the configuration for one test to say, like, I want to run this test where the spawner is going to fail. So I'm measuring what happens when launching fails. So all these are functions that are decorated with this PyTest fixture decorator. Right, so this cleanup after does some things saying, delete all the users I might have created during the test to make sure that I'm starting fresh for the next test. And so fixtures are kind of anything that we reuse or that wants to get cleaned up after the test. And so part of what it's going to be relevant for the testing project is figuring out which kind of some subset of what we got here that should maybe belong in its own package to make it easier for the implementations of the spawner and the implementations of the authenticator API to write their own tests without having to re-implement a lot of these fixtures. And then the test. So one test might say, so this is the get users test. So the app fixture means make sure JupyterHub's running. We make an API request to that endpoint, and then we do some checks on the response. The next piece of the repo that I wanted to look at is in the share directory. There is a templates directory, and this is where all the pages. So we viewed when we saw those few JupyterHub pages. Those are served from these templates. So these are all HTML files that are templated with a tool called Jinja. So here's the home page that has that Start My Server button. Here you can see, where is it? Yeah, here's the Start My Server button. But in addition to plain HTML, it has these curly braces with % that say, if your server is already running, add the stop button, right? So the stop button's only there if your server's running, right? We shouldn't have a stop button if there's no server to stop. And then the Start My Server button is always there. but the start word is only there if it's not running, right? So if it is running, it's a link to your server that just says my server. If it's not running, it says start. And so we have one of these templates for every one of the pages that we have, and this is where a lot of the accessibility work is going to be done, and is probably in improving the HTML of most of these pages. Right, and the last thing that we were going to do is set up JupyterHub for working on the documentation. So the documentation have their own requirements. There's a requirements.txt file. So I installed those. That was the dependency I was missing when you saw that error a little earlier, when I ran PyTest without the JupyterHub argument. So I install the documentation requirements, whatever those are. That will, if you haven't installed it already, that will also do an editable install of JupyterHub itself, because you do have to have JupyterHub installed in order to build the docs. And so in the docs directory, the main thing you need to know is make HTML.
Min, is make another thing that you can install with Brew on Mac and apps on Linux?
Make will Make is part of the system on a Mac, so you don't need to install it. On Linux, you can apt-get install make, or it'll. I'm pretty sure Python dev will get it, because Python dev will depend on build essential, which is all the kind of basic build tools, which includes compilers and make and things like that. Python 3 dev, I believe Python 3, if you don't tell it to not install recommended packages, I believe that will depend on the files required for make. But if you don't, you can install make.
Thank
if you
you.
don't have it. And the nice thing on Ubuntu, let me just check. I think Ubuntu has some nice error messages if you try to run make. If you have a real install and not a Docker image, I don't know where those packages come from. If you try to run make and you don't have it, yeah, make is a package name, so not make. So make HTML is build HTML docs. So yeah, so you can apt install make, and then make is part of the system on the Mac. So it's likely that however you got here, you ended up with make, but just in case, you can install it with that. And what this did is it compiled the documentation, which is now in build HTML. And if we open the index file, I have the JupyterHub documentation that we were just reading. But if you look at the URL, now it's a file URL, because this is my local build of the docs from my computer that I just made, instead of the build from the on the web. So I can edit. So all the files are in this source directory, and each file that ends with .md, that will be an HTML page. So this index.html is made from that's my editor, which is not on this window. So here is this. JupyterHub is the best way to serve. I can add some text there. Let's make it bold. And then if I rebuild the documentation, and then if I refresh this page, you can see I've got that text I added. So when you're working on the documentation, you edit the files in there, and the layout of the files, it's not a, so we use something called Sphinx to build our documentation. And it's, so each file in the docs source directory corresponds to a file, an HTML file in the build directory. So if I look at, right, so this looks very similar, right? So indexabout.md becomes indexabout.html. So whatever file, whatever markdown file you're working on, you can open the corresponding HTML file and just run make HTML and then refresh the page to see the changes. And there's a useful command called make link check that will tell you if there are broken links in the documentation, right? If you're reorganizing things, it'll tell you if there are any links that point to pages that aren't there anymore. And this passes as of last night, I think, because we weren't checking regularly, and we'd let some links get old. Yeah, I think that was what I meant to cover for today. So I covered kind of a little bit of what JupyterHub is, how to get set up locally for kind of local poking around, running the tests, and building the documentation. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about any other any questions folks have, or if there are any topics that I should have covered.